Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining our session focusing on women and girls in COVID response and recovery. We have a fantastic panel being moderated by Caren Greene. She's the Global Director of Gender at the World Bank, focused on generating evidence on what boosts gender equality. We then have Valerie Hudson as our first speaker, University Distinguished Professor from the Bush School of Government and Public Service at Texas A&M University, where she also directs the program on women, peace, and security. We have Patricia Greene with us, the former director, Women's Bureau from the U.S. Department of Labor, and founding member of the Diana Project, a research group dedicated to studying women business owners and their businesses. Finally, rounding out our panel, we have Gary Barker, CEO and founder of Promundo, a leading voice in engaging men and boys in advancing gender equality and positioning positive masculinity. So I'm going to hand it over to Caren for our panel. Thank you so much for joining us here at SID.
Thank you so much, Sharon, and it is a great pleasure to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be. I'm really thrilled to moderate this panel on women and girls in COVID recovery and response. And I'd like to frame our discussion for a few minutes before we start our conversation. This will be a conversation, and I'd like to invite you to join it with posting your comments and questions in the chat function. We know that the economy, society, politics are not gender neutral. COVID itself is not gender neutral, and neither should our response be. Emerging evidence, which Valerie will talk a little bit more about from a variety of sources, suggests that there are a number of impacts or channels that we really need to be aware of and track through this pandemic. And I guess I want to make the point that the pandemic is not just a health pandemic, it's also accompanied by a very severe economic crisis in almost every country around the world. And I would say that some people also call it a triple crisis because of alarming rates of things like intimate partner violence. So there are multiple crises. So what are some of the impacts if we think about this? Well, in the economic space, of course, we know from the data that we have from around the world that suggests that women's jobs are being lost at a higher rate than men's jobs. Here, the numbers have come out in the US recently, and this is for a few reasons. One is because of occupational segregation, the fact that women concentrate in those sectors that are hardest hit, whether it's tourism, hospitality, retail, food, etc. And there's evidence to suggest that women's jobs are not going to be coming back as fast as men's jobs. In a large part of the world, particularly where I work, women predominate in informal employment. And those jobs are very much affected by lockdowns, for instance, as street vendor markets close with restrictions on mobility and so forth. And those workers are particularly vulnerable because they do not have access to social protection systems. They're generally not in a social registry or covered. So the economic implications are big. There's also impacts on firms in the private sector. We have just finished or in the process of collecting a variety of surveys from our colleagues at the IFC through Business Pulse surveys, and actually a survey that we did jointly with Facebook on business owners in Facebook that suggests that women entrepreneurs, women small and medium firm owners are disproportionately affected compared to men in terms of reductions in their profits, reductions in their sales, and they have higher closure and exit rates. And the reductions in profits and sales are particularly great in the context of stringent lockdowns. So actually work that we can do thinking about the policy response to help women-owned businesses, which is something Patricia will talk about, is very important. Third, because of these multiple crises, we see around the world increases in responsibilities for care. We know with school closures, kids are at home. Women, by and large, are bearing that responsibility for parenting for children. Men are certainly taking it up more, and I'll come back to this with Gary, but not nearly the extent to which women are responsible. And when you think about male mortality and you think about illness, women do a lot of the caregiving. Women are also on the front lines of the health workforce in most countries, and in some countries, they're up to 90% of that health workforce. So they have increased morbidity and exposure to the pandemic itself. So that's another channel of impact. A third channel of impact, which I reference, is increases in GBV. Many are tracking calls to helplines, to shelters, and so forth. And that's important. And I hear anecdotally, although I don't have the numbers, in particular contexts of things like increases in child marriage, particularly among refugee communities, where they don't have access to economic resources. And marrying girls young is a strategy to help cope with the pandemic. So we can go through all of these impacts, but I think it's really important to keep these impacts in mind and to think about the response. What do we want to see in with our world leaders, with our governments, with our NGOs that are out there on the front lines? What do we see in what I call the building forward stronger? It's not building back better. I'd like to see a vision about building forward stronger. And what would be the elements of that vision for building back stronger, and how do we make it actionable? How do we make it actionable in terms of the partnerships that we need to have, whether it's the partnerships between NGOs and the private sector and the governments, or in specific stakeholder groups in any of these sectors. So the conversation today is going to focus a little bit more deeply on what we know about COVID, but focusing particularly with ideas for building back stronger. Again, I'd like to invite you to join the conversation by putting your comments and questions in chat, which we'll be monitoring. And I'd like to actually turn the floor first to Valerie Hudson, who you heard about. She's going to give us a little bit of the overview. In our preliminary conversation, we talked about the data availability and the data challenges that we are all facing in tracking during this pandemic. So Valerie's going to start us off with some of that. Over to you, Valerie.
Thanks very much, Caren. I kind of do data for a living. I'm one of the founders of the Women's Stats Project. And so I was really keen to discover if the call that we've had for better data concerning women has actually brought forth any fruit during this time of COVID. And I'm happy to tell you that it has to a certain extent. So let me highlight three particular data gathering efforts that are looking for gendered information about COVID. The first one that you see here is a partnership between Global Health 50/50, ICRW, and others. And it is the COVID tracker. And so one of the most important things that COVID tracker does is it's looking at cases, and it's looking at deaths and various permutations of deaths, such as deaths among healthcare workers and so forth. But I found this opening map that they have very interesting, which is that all of the countries in red have no sex disaggregated data on cases or deaths reported. And look at how much territory that red covers. So that's pretty sad that we're still, even in the year 2020, grasping to find sex disaggregated data on simple things such as even death. The second, and I'm grateful to Caren for pointing this out to me, is a UNDP initiative called the Global Gender Response Tracker. And this is very interesting because it's not looking at cases or deaths. Rather, it's looking to see if governments have made any differences in their policy that take into account gender. For example, you see their dashboard here. So I was interested in measures on violence against women that you see up here. And I was interested to see, okay, what kind of measures are there? What kinds of policies exist? I went into the tracker, and you'll notice that there's a potential of maybe 704 different policies that I could look at. And I looked at the subcategory of the integration of violence against women in policies, looked in Europe, and decided to pick Italy. Why not? And when you drill down, then what I find is that what Italy has done to take into account violence against women and girls is that during the strict lockdown period, victims were exempt from some rules. That is, the requirement to carry a document justifying why they're leaving their home if they need to visit a refuge, which again is interesting, but doesn't help me understand some of the things I think that Caren was pointing out. So this next slide here is the Center for Global Development. And Amber Peterman and Megan O'Donnell have taken it upon themselves to try to find whatever published information there is about the rates of violence against women and girls. And to date, I just checked a couple of days ago, so to date, they have found 44 instances were publicly reported figures about increases in violence against women. But that's 44, and many of them are for the same countries, more developed countries, as you can imagine. So this is just a very brave effort on their part. But I think all of this, right, kind of speaks to probably what my message would be today is this is awesome. It's certainly different than anything we've had in the past, that we immediately, right, have some gender sources or data sources on gendered effects of COVID. But heck, there is so much more that ideally you would want. And one of the things that really galls me is that the models and simulations that were constructed to deal with COVID did not examine the likely effects of lockdown on women and girls. And so this is our chance, right? We must use this time to gather the data necessary to amend those models and simulations. I really think it's incumbent upon us to do so. What are the kinds of things that I would like to see if I was part of the team that was doing modeling and simulations? I'd like to see the nationally reported increases in domestic violence calls, injuries, and deaths. I want to see what the effect was on police response. Are police less likely to respond to a domestic violence call if it's in the middle of a lockdown? I want to know if shelters, right, have been impacted by lockdown and what that means in terms of the increase or decrease in their intake numbers. I want to know what the effect was on female suicide rates, the effect on usual medical treatment for females, such as breast cancer. We know that there have been quite a few women who are now in the terminal stages of breast cancer because they were forbidden from seeking their normal chemotherapy or radiotherapy treatments. What was the effect on preventative care, which, as Caren notes, is often in the purview of the mothers, such as what if mothers are unable to get their children immunized for disease? What are the effects on the fertility rates, access to contraception, abortion rates? Nobody's reporting these things. And as Caren points out, we've seen that some communities, there appears to be a significant uptick in child marriage, which is certainly, I think, a form of violence against women and girls. And these are just questions about health and physical well-being. I mean, there are many other questions that Caren pointed to in terms of education, female economic productivity, and others that should be answered in this more holistic way as well. In other words, the task before us is to figure out what was the differential cost to females of various governmental COVID responses. That's what we would like to do as the result of what we're seeing now, which is that the differential effect on females was not factored in at all in any of the government models and simulations of which I'm aware. Thanks very much for this time.
Great. Thank you so much, Valerie. I think that was a really fantastic framing from the data side. And let me just supplement what Valerie said with one other point. The World Bank Group is also running surveys, household surveys, telephone surveys in 140 questions to just get basic information from a randomly selected respondent in the household on their economic impacts, the social impacts, the health impacts, and so forth. And one of the things that I can tell you that's coming out already from countries in East Asia and the Pacific and Latin America is because of lockdowns and shutdowns, the health impact that's really suffering is kids are not getting vaccinated. And we see that in several countries. I did a talk last night in East Asia and the Pacific, in Laos, in PNG, in countries like Timor-Leste, Indonesia. So that actually will have repercussions for the future. One other thing about what you said that I think is important to point out is that we don't have complete data on any domain. The data that is being tracked that Valerie showed us is partial. And it's partial in a lot of ways because we don't have data on all of the questions that she asked for, but many other domains. And we have a high non-response even for questions that we care about. And one of the things that really struck me, and this is going to be the segue to you, Patricia, in the UNDP, UN Women Policy Response Tracker, which is something Valerie showed, is that we have more information from some of these data sources on violence against women. And we don't have as much information on the economic side. And so we can look for it to advanced countries like the US, which do report unemployment figures. But many developing countries, the open unemployment figure is just not the right thing. But we do need to know about things like loss of income, loss of livelihood opportunities, particularly for those who are informal. And then we don't have as much data as we might need on firms. So Patricia, I'd like to ask you to talk a little bit about, since you worked at Goldman Sachs and you think about women you were part of the 10,000 Women Initiative and you think about firms, and you were the former head of the Women's Bureau, how should we be thinking about what kind of information should we be trying to encourage people to collect in this space on jobs, job losses, on firms, and what do you see here in the US on this?
Yeah, well, just to clarify though, Caren, I didn't work for Goldman Sachs. I did that as part of being a professor at Babson. So Babson had the grant, we did the work for Goldman. So
great.
Just to clarify a little bit there, but thanks for that question, because I think too, that tracker is such an amazing tool. And as Valerie showed, I think there were 704 policies about violence and almost nothing on the economic side. And I think part of it is we haven't figured out where we're trying to go on the economic side. So you started off by saying about build forward stronger. And I love when you talked about that in our prep call too, because I think if all we try and do is get back to where we were, we've really screwed it up. I made the mistake of using the term punctuated equilibrium at a book club recently. But I think that's what we're really thinking about is we were going along, there was some progress in some areas, but not enough, not fast enough. And now we have this opportunity that the systems that were broken are now shattered. But what do we want them to look like? During my time at the Women's Bureau, we basically established there are 15 different ways in which women likely experience different things in the ways they come into the workforce, their experiences while they're there, and the rewards they take away from them. The challenge is they're all connected. So what happens oftentimes in these policies is we look at just one. We'll look at just family care, or we'll look at just paid leave, or we'll look at just wage gaps, those kinds of things, instead of recognizing how interconnected they really all are and thinking through that. So what we've been starting to talk about from a policy perspective, and this we is just people of interest, it's not any formal group, is using an entrepreneurial framework to think about these 15 different ways that do impact work experiences and come up with ideas on how we actually change the world of work. What it means to work, how we work, where we work, when we work, all those kinds of things. And Gary, I'm eager to hear from you too, because this is not just change the world of work for women, but I always say I have 3 sons. I want the world to be good for everybody. So using a framework where we look at opportunities, what are the opportunities that we can have for women in the workforce? What are the resources? And happy to talk more about that part later. And how do they become leaders? Because the whole thing comes together with opportunities, resources, leadership to create value. And that's really what I think we need a new policy framework.
That's so great. And I'm going to come back to you for some of the specifics on the framework. Gary, so that was Patricia gave me the perfect segue, which I was going to ask you about anyway. While we talk about women and girls, we cannot forget the importance of men and boys. And I wanted, in addition to data, there are all kinds of things that data just can't capture. And I'm thinking here about things like social norms, for instance, about certain kinds of behavior and so forth. And when I think about that, we haven't yet talked about the impact of the pandemic on men and boys. And I also think in terms of norms of masculinity. And I would love to have you start with that and then move to, we'll come back to violence against women, but let's keep the economic focus right now. Move to what Patricia said in terms of the world of work. And I think the world of work is so critical because of caregiving as well and men's roles in that. So if you could cover that, that would be great.
Okay, in 5 minutes or 3. So, first on the norms, we do actually have some data on that. We knew before COVID and during COVID, men who buy into a rigid, inequitable set of norms around manhood are less likely to care for their own health and the health of others around them. We also know from data there's a lot, mostly coming up from global north settings, but we think it also holds up anecdotally in the global south. Men are less likely to be following what we're supposed to be doing during COVID. And we have a few, shall we say, very visible examples of that to be seen around us. And young men in particular, for whom part of the way they often define their identity as being defiant of orders, seem to be the least likely to be mask wearing and practicing social distancing, et cetera. We see those showing up in the global 50-50 tracker in terms of what's going on of who is experiencing COVID. So if you're hospitalized, and then if you're in ICU and if you die, we're seeing rates of 14 men to every 10 women who are dying from COVID. Part of that's biological, but part of that is because the way we're often socialized as boys and men is not to seek help. And when we seek it, it's often later. And this is not just the deaths of men. This is households typically led by women who are the ones who pick up the pieces. And so I think it's important to notice, to say whether it's COVID or other mortality, and men we already know die on average 5 years earlier than women in most parts of the world, it is women who pick up those pieces. That has an impact on women's poverty and time use and all the rest. So something about masculinity and paying attention to what public health science tells us is clearly gendered in terms of what it means of men not paying attention to those and women paying often the price for men's inattention to those. Then on the, I think also the issue of violence that came up, which relates both to health and to economic well-being. We have a growing amount of some approaches that do work in terms of prevention of engaging young men and adult men. Parent training, for example, school-based education with young people, engaging coaches to reach young men, engaging men as allies in women's economic empowerment. All those things can work. None of those things can be implemented during COVID. So as we see a spike, we also see just how difficult it is to switch some of those prevention activities to be online and whether we think those are effective or not. So really the importance of focusing on response, but we need to think about what we also worry about is what the spike could mean years from now. Boys who witness their father or another man use violence in the household are 3 to 3.5 times more likely to use it later on. So we also have the challenge of what this means of a spike of violence that pays forward in this generation of boys, as well as girls who are witnessing it growing up. Lastly, then onto the care work issue, and perhaps we can come back to it. And I think you said this at the beginning, Caren. We've done a couple of household surveys. Several countries have done them as well. We did some together with Oxfam, finding that we started with this inequality. Women have been doing 3.3 times the amount of daily care work. During COVID, everybody is doing more. Men seem to continue to report that they're doing even more than women see them do. So that discrepancy is always there in the reporting. The interesting thing to look at is that men are doing things they didn't do before. So we may be we've been talking about breaking the glass ceiling. We've also got the dirty floor and the kitchen, floor that we also need to break to give the sense that men can do this stuff and that some of these social norms can in fact be changed. So we do see men doing more, but still not enough. And the other piece that we think we need to look at is understanding how we get men to see the importance of the care economy. So will they vote for policies that are subsidized childcare? for example, and be part of understanding that the care economy is part of all of us. And then finally, the work loss. We know that work loss for men is one of the stressors that can be associated with men's use of violence. We know that from world value surveys around the world, if we ask women and men when jobs are scarce, men's jobs are more important. How many women and men support that idea? So as women have been the first usually to leave the paid workplace, what does this mean of any kind of recovery? I think it suggests we've got a huge amount of work coming back to it. And then finally, just a point, if I have 30 seconds more, if we look at cash transfers and social protection, most of those in countries that have rolled those out or increased them or kept them going during COVID have seen that they work. And those funds have typically been put in the hands of women for lots and lots and lots of good reasons. We did a review of them before COVID last year, showing that only 4 out of about 150 that we looked at had anything that tried to nudge men to do more of the care work at home. So I think we missed some important opportunities of some of the biggest social protection programs that we need even more during COVID, and we're going to need at least for the next year, if not more, that we kind of look at men as if we won't change, or that kind of men's lives are somehow separate planets than women. Anyway, we'll come back to those, but I want to.
Yeah, let's come. I appreciate from the three of you that framing. A number of questions are coming in from the chat. I'm going to go ahead and start asking them in a few minutes, but I want to do one more set of questions with our panelists. Valerie, I want to ask you, since your data showed and Gary referenced the increases in gender-based violence, and you're a specialist on fragile and conflict-affected situations, and I wonder, probably we're not getting good information data on GBV there, but I'm wondering how you're thinking about, or what you think the impacts are. I mean, you touched on child marriage. That's something in FCV context probably increasing. But what else can you tell us about GBV in those contexts and other impacts of COVID in those contexts?
That's an excellent question. I really think that what we need to be looking at is whether these differential effects on women and girls are increasing the level of instability within these fragile societies. And I absolutely think that we are going to see that that's the case. As you yourself mentioned, child marriage is a big driver of instability, simply because of all of the many cascading negative effects from child marriage, not only for the girls who are married, of course, but also for the children that then are born to those child brides. It's also true that polygamy, more technically polygyny, increases in times of emergency. So just like we see an uptick in child marriage, we would also see an uptick in polygyny. And as bride prices and dowries, et cetera, are changing hands in times of exigency. We know that polygyny is a huge risk factor for instability because it tends to leave a larger than normal segment of the young adult male population without any hope of marrying and forming families. And so, for example, researchers have found that rebel and guerrilla recruitment is easiest when polygyny starts to rise precipitously. And that's usually accompanied by a rise in bride price, right, which is pricing young men out of the market. So yeah, I think there's going to be some real tie-in. I think there'll be increasing destabilization as a result of the differential impact of COVID on the two sexes. Yeah.
Thanks. And we're going to be transitioning in the next part of the conversation, the part that I'm going to facilitate before I get to the questions, on policy responses. And I know you've been following the Women, Peace and Security agenda and what different countries are doing. And I'm wondering if you think that COVID should have, in the context of COVID, there should be any pivots or different approaches that the humanitarian and the humanitarian / development community should be taking. But let me come back to you on that, let you think about that. Patricia, I want to ask you to talk a little bit more about what this framework is. And you mentioned opportunities and resources. Are these frameworks already part of a policy response conversation here in the US that you're seeing, or not, or in other countries?
Pieces of it, and I think that again is the challenge, is that most of the policy pieces that we've seen are more in the financial resource piece, which can be extremely helpful, but not alone. So what else can we put it together to look at the whole thing? If we think about the opportunities, and for this one, I'll think more about the women business owners, the ones that are surviving in this, largely are the ones that were able to pivot, to find different ways to go to market or different products and services, those types of things, rather than hunker down, this is my business. And that actually requires different kinds of advising, different kinds of support, different kinds of training and education. So I think that's something to think about for, many programs. We work a lot with FMO, the Dutch Economic Development Bank, and they do train-the-trainer programs to work with bankers to help them think differently about the kinds of programs they have. So from the opportunity perspective, it's more about learning to think about your business as opportunity-based than as specific product and service-based. I think that comes into play with policy when you think about a lot of government procurement as well, and driving the changes that have long been needed in government and corporate procurement around the world. On the resource piece, as I said, there's been a lot of attention on the financial and the PPP, and there's a number of studies.
Wait a minute, by PPP, you mean public-private partnerships, or do you mean something else?
No, it's the Paycheck Procurement Program.
Oh, the
US program.
PPP stands for a lot of things.
Shouldn't lapse into that. But Amanda Elam worked with the Diana International Research Institute, and she's gathering up all the studies that are being done around PPP and looking at some of the gender challenges that we've learned about those, and doing some comparative analysis of all those studies so that we can figure out what worked well in this and what didn't. The other things to look at too, for instance, we were talking a lot about losing jobs, and of course that's a devastating piece of this. I don't want to sound like Pollyanna, but the slightly flip side of that is small businesses have long had a very hard time hiring. And right now, if they position their businesses differently, there are more people available to hire. So again, it's getting away from a deficit model. I think pre-COVID, very much women worked in a deficit model. If only they had more of this kind of education, or if only they had more of fill in the blank, then they would be like the man, and then everything would be hunky-dory, instead of looking at how do we actually all learn from each other to design this new world of business and recognize what that might look like. And I think that's the idea of using a framework to put it all together.
Are there any other legs in the framework besides opportunities and resources?
Leadership, the leadership piece. Yeah, and I think that's another part where public policy can really come into play, and not just on the education and training piece of it, but also the leadership of different countries, understanding better how this actually works, how it might work, and leading the conversation about a different kind of future. So leadership is a very, very critical part of that.
So one piece of this, and I don't know if you have much to say about it, but I'm going to go to our other panelists on this as well. One approach to building forward better is, as we learned from the months and months that we've been locked down, is the need for access to the internet, digital services, digital jobs, and so forth. And this is a really important gender issue because there is a gender digital divide. If you look at the data from GSMA and the World Wide Web Foundation, 300 million women, fewer women than men own mobile phones or have access to technology. So in the Building Forward Stronger, the approaches have to be to think about the use of digital technologies and in the world of work. But I'll come to Gary in a minute in terms of the use of digital for some of the issues that you also deal with. But Patricia, do you have anything to say about that? It may not be a gap in the US, more so in other parts of the world.
but it is a gap in some places of the U.S. We worked with one woman business owner who lived in she lived outside of Pittsburgh, but in the mountains outside of Pittsburgh, and used to have to go out and shake the snow off her dish in order to have good satellite. So not as much, granted, but this is one of the resources. Out of the 6 kinds of resources we specifically talk about, technology is one of them, and probably right now one of the most important, both for access to education and training, access to networks to get other kinds of resources, and access to learn more about leadership. Yeah. So absolutely critical to think about the impact of that.
And some of the studies show that there's a confidence gap. Women are less confident or have less trust in the digital approach. So that's something that we definitely need to build in for recovery. But Gary, let me come back to you now, because I think that digital, when you think about this, we have a question here about, do we have good examples of access to services in different countries for survivors of gender-based violence? And actually, I mentioned violence against women, but obviously there's got to be some cases still of increases in violence against boys and other things. And, one of the things that we need to keep running are digital services. So what are you saying in terms of the work that you're doing, and how do you see, are there good models using digital or other approaches?
Yeah, a few countries have, but we work less in the protective services side and more on the prevention side, but certainly have been reading about lots of examples of how to make it safe for women to report, whether that can be, but again, this goes back to who has mobile phones in their hand, who can be online, but trying to find safe ways, including limited spaces where women are out, engaging store shop owners, et cetera, on ways that women can advise that they're experiencing violence that they can't escape from except for the limited amount of time that they're out of the home. This is trying to build on some experiences with violence against children as well that we think has also increased. So building on things like Childline, which is trying to make access for children to be able to report abuse and violence against them as well. And then, we're starting to look at what about increases of violence online? And whether, cyberbullying and multiple forms of sexual harassment online as well. And I think that's an area that it feels like we have less research, but not surprisingly, if that becomes the realm where certain forms of men's violence, whether against women or other boys and men, those are places where where it gets carried out. And of course, we also worry about the number of hours that some young and adult men are spending online, and some of the men's rights or backlash work, or groups rather. So whether those are incels or men going their own way stuff, most of that's a northern, a global north phenomenon. But there are groups in parts of urban Latin America, some parts of urban Asia, where we're also seeing kind of the organization of, as the algorithms circle you back into anti-feminist men's discussion group, they exist, and we got to think about that as well.
How do you think about responding to that?
I mean, there's a couple of groups that are learning from some approaches of combating violent extremism, of how do you kind of offer escape routes? How do you engage some men who have gone down some of those rabbit holes and come back and say, wow, that's really a dangerous, scary place. How can I talk to others? So trying to, I think the first part is, as Valerie started us off on, is finding some data. So there's a couple of groups, Moonshot and some others, that are doing some research on, what is this world of the manosphere? What do we know about them? So we can begin to think about how to question and combat in thoughtful ways.
That's really important. Maybe you could put that in the chat function in terms of the reference. One thing I want to follow up on from the chat with you, Gary, that's coming up is, and I'm going to broaden the question a little bit. How does I'm going to try to phrase this well, the resurgence, if you will, or the exhibition of toxic masculinity in this context, and particularly of our leaders, how do you think that's affecting the trajectory of response to COVID? And from your work with men's groups, how do we take that on constructively? Is there a role for policy? Is this something for NGOs like you to work on? What do you need to help on this?
Yeah, oof, man, how many hours do we have to talk about that? I think some of the backlash or an increase or a resurgence in harmful ideas about masculinity were happening before COVID. and we've seen how they've influenced elections. Men's voting patterns in, and we can fill in the blank, Brazil, US, India, in terms of a support for a certain kind of, however you want to fill in the blank, masculinist, despotic leadership that plays on the fear of lots of men. And some of that fear we know is economic based. So, the uncertainty, economic uncertainty we've seen in our research in the International Men and Gender Equality surveys that we've done in about 40 plus countries. In situations where men feel economically stressed or uncertain, they are more likely to, or less likely to support kind of healthier, more equitable versions of manhood. And we see that, not surprisingly, we see those trends with voters. So we need leadership and voting. We've got to figure out how we both engage men in this dialogue without seeing feminism or women's rights as antithetical to what is good for them too. So I think, we've got to do a lot more work where we highlight to men that healthier versions of manhood are better for all of us, and to look at household well-being ideas, to engagement in thoughtful ways, not giving away any of the space that we need to for women's economic empowerment and women's employment approaches, but also approaches that say we need short-term support for all workers. And I think we've seen better, in countries that have done that, I think we've seen that their gender policies don't tend to step as much into the backlash side of things. And we need good leadership. In fact, men learning from a lot of the women leadership that we've seen in times of COVID could be great if having men humble enough to say, I could learn from that approach, couldn't I? So yeah, leadership, public education stuff. We're doing some stuff with younger boys because we know how early how early the process of promoting unhealthy masculinities begins. So a lot of work in terms of what we do with children. And I probably have about 4 other things, but I'll stop there.
Okay, I'll come back to you on that. Valerie, I wanted to ask you to answer the question I asked previously is, do we need, does the humanitarian field need to pivot in light of this pandemic, and what should they be doing? And, particularly in light of, I think of people who are in fragile and conflict affected settings and refugees and internally displaced people in particular as being those who really the hardest because they don't have access to the services. They are, even the public health approaches may be difficult. What do you think the pivot ought to be?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned displaced persons because, one of the things that we know is that economic exigency and the types of things that we're seeing with COVID naturally increase internal displacement and also displacement across borders, with countries then responding by, tightening immigration controls, which, from their point of view makes perfect sense as well. So I do think that the humanitarian community must be aware that the needs have changed. So I'm not going to presume to speak for them, but I think there are all these interrelated issues. For example, in the chat box, one of the audience was talking about, do we even know whether this has increased survival sex and prostitution? We don't. What about STD rates? How are those being affected by the lockdown and the differences between men and women? I don't think we know that either. But I sort of see it holistically. I see how all of these things are kind of linked together. Gary was mentioning how exigency also breeds a toxic form of masculinity. It really does, right? When you put men under tremendous pressure, sometimes they feel that pressure will be relieved if they're able to coerce and dominate and abuse those who are closest to them. And that's also, I think, a stability concern. What we found is that attitudes of sex inequality, that is, attitudes about how men are superior to women that we see in some of these men's rights communities, are absolutely associated with the same attitudes towards other outgroups. So men who hold more gender unequal beliefs are also much more likely to hold race unequal beliefs and are much more likely to advocate the use of force against others in the international system. So that primary turn against women on the part of men doesn't just stay with women. It tends to, spill over into a wide variety of attitudes that are not going to stabilize the country or bring peace to the country.
Gary, do you want to add anything more to what Valerie has just said on this?
Yeah, no, I mean, just to reinforce, I mean, we find that in rigorous household survey data, we find that the more, whether you want to call it toxic masculinity, we've called it the man box, but there's a cluster of negative outcomes that come out of there, whether increased use of violence or harassment against women and girls, bullying behaviors, many of those racist or ethnic based or xenophobic based, as well as, willingness to support different armed groups. So there's a cluster of harmful behaviors that I think at the same time, we've got to acknowledge that there's been a huge amount of work to counter them. And part of what we see as the backlash is really a success of a couple of decades, 3 decades of still incomplete, but positive outcomes of women's empowerment and women's equality policies. And so I think, how do we shape some of those that help to show the benefit to men as well? Data from Europe, for example, finding that where men do a greater share of the household care work, there's lower homicide rates. And homicide rates are 90% men killing other men. So, finding ways that our health, our well-being as men is tied up together with that of women and girls. And let's march shoulder to shoulder for this equality piece that we all benefit from, if some men can put down that anger and the harmful ideas.
I think those kinds of snippets, like what you just said of the association between sharing household and care work and homicide rates, is very tantalizing, and that could be moved into a policy message going forward. Both you, Gary, and Patricia have talked about leadership, and I want to return to you, Patricia, on the leadership issue. And you mentioned a little bit about this, but we have a question from one of our panelists about, we have seen, and both of you have referenced the fact, there's been the news reports on how women leaders have perhaps managed this or the response to this pandemic better than some of the, particularly those that are the machismo or the toxic masculinity in going forward. And community leaders, women community leaders have really stepped forward. We've been hearing about the wonderful efforts of colleagues, for instance, in India, the leaders of SEVA, all those SEVA leaders stepping up to provide community kitchens, also in Latin America, to make linkages to get the food distributed for people who don't have mobile, getting them to cash. How can international agencies, what advice would you give them to focus on leadership at all levels and women's voices to be more maximized in this pandemic? So Patricia, let me start with you on that question from the chat.
Yeah, and I think that ties back again to Caren, to your stressing on things need to be actionable, because it's great to learn about it. And believe me, I'm the first one to say we need more data on everything, and then figure out, because we now know this, what do we do? So we have all these incredible women who are leading their communities. I think one thing we can all do to help them is to amplify their voice and their messages. So use our outlets to help share what they're doing, convene so that they can talk, and of course virtually, but so they can talk and share and learn best practices, things that worked and things that didn't work. But then also to possibly, through some of us, get the data to use for their own stories with their own governments, to show how powerful it really is what they're doing, how there are many of them, and then help drive that through to action.
Valerie, any comments on leadership?
Well, I think I'd just like to echo what I said at the beginning, which was there was a noticeable dearth of women among the modeling and simulation teams that were assembled by the governments. as a prelude to determining what the response would be. And I think that's absolutely shocking. And certainly there should have been someone, at least one, hopefully more than one person at the table who would be able to articulate the sex differentiated concerns, all right, for each of the proposed, government approaches. And that was not there. So we have to do better than that. And that's certainly something that I would press home to anyone who was willing to listen.
Yeah. And Gary, any
Karen,
further?
may I just
Go ahead, Patricia. Yeah.
I just really like to push on that too. We just can't let this happen anymore. That we're not in, there are no women in these conversations that are shaping new models and building new systems and that kind of thing. That will take us back to the same old, and this is just not the time for that.
Yeah. Gary, any further thoughts on this? And then I'll have one final question for each of you.
Yeah, very much want to think about how we raise, this generation of boys to both expect and demand that there are no sessions like that they would look at a picture of the cabinets, the ministries in many parts of the world and say, if it's not 50% women in the room, what is wrong with this? And I think in a few countries that have established a track record with at least closer to equality in women's leadership, the young men who are coming of age, that is normal for them. And they are part of saying, hey, what's up with this? So I do think kind of planting the seeds for just, this has to be normal. And I want our sons and daughters to look at, at a picture at a cabinet meeting and say, excuse me, where are the women? There is no meeting here if we're not 50%, whether that's negotiating, peace in Afghanistan or in a certain office building not too many blocks from where I live. So that seems so obvious and necessary.
So one of the things that I think is coming out of this conversation that we haven't yet talked about, but I think is really important, and which you've touched on a few times, Gary, is the next generation. And Patricia sort of referenced this a little bit in terms of education. So the question of education is really critical. And, it's fantastic that the attitudes of the next generation, younger people, are changing. But it seems to me that through the education system, the education systems in different countries, we can do much more to think through changing gender norms, stereotypes, and conflict resolution approaches, for instance, that would help with violence against women or children. But sometimes governments are resistant to thinking about this, and the NGOs have been excellent at it, but not always the governments. And when you think about building forward stronger, this seems to me it ought to be an approach that we take as we rebuild education systems. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on that. Gary, I'll start with you.
Oh, okay. I do think we've been making the case and need to do more of it, that a whole school approach to ending harassment and violence at school, for example, and doing that together with bullying reduction can't be something that sits on the side of academics. And in fact, I think the data is is quite strong that where there are higher rates of harassment and bullying, both that are always gendered, but particularly boys' violence against girls, but also boys' violence against other boys, that education suffers. And so I think we've got to continue, we've got to build into our budgets that the kind of prevention work that we know can work, and there's plenty of examples of that have been funded for years or supported by the World Bank and USAID and others, that those can't just be add-ons. And I think it's equally important that, as we think about the STEM argument, that we're also thinking about the participation of men and boys in the HEAL side of things. So most folks don't know that we also have a set of abbreviations that we use to talk about health, education, and learning professions that are almost always dominated by women, or not dominated by, they are predominantly women, and that we need men in those professions as well, so that we send across the notion that the education of young people, the care of bodies, the care of our households is not male or female, but human. So I'd like to see both that we build in the kind of gender equality education together with academics, not seeing as separate, and that we also pay attention to engaging men in primary education and in childcare, that we send those messages early on that we all do this.
Great, thanks for that. Okay, this is my final set of questions, and I'll start with Valerie. So I want to turn toward, what are the elements of a building forward stronger world that we need, where we started? Obviously we need the systems of data collection and data dissemination, and they need to be stronger. There's so much that we don't know that we think it's really important to know. So I'll start with that. But we also know, and this pandemic and economic crisis have just revealed the cracks in systems. We need really strong social protection systems. People need to be able to have cash. They need to be able to have lifelines thrown to them to support consumption. In countries like India or Ghana, where we work, informal workers need to come into those systems. They need to have Social Security, which they may not have, and pensions. So all of the systems change, for instance, of who's excluded comes into it. They may need to have the kind of cash transfers and support for care, both for men and for women that you referenced, Gary, which some countries are topping up right now, but which may not be made permanent. Clearly, there's changes in the education system, which you were just talking about, for stronger systems in recovery. And we clearly need a systems approach to GBV prevention and response across the board. And of course, when we think about the private sector, we need to ensure that the financial institutions, the non-bank financial institutions, are ensuring the liquidity, are figuring out different insolvency regimes to help women-owned firms recover more quickly. We probably need digital approaches in terms of market platforms, digital e-commerce platforms, and so forth. So all of these things are visions for a building forward stronger. I'd like to ask each of you now, is there any other element you'd like to add or something you want to reinforce, number one? And two, are you hopeful that this crisis represents an opportunity for a pivot? And then we'll stop. So let me start with you, Valerie.
Actually, you summed it up so well, I have nothing to add. But yeah, I mean, this is, the old cliche. Every catastrophe is also an opportunity to see things differently, an opportunity to do things differently. And I think the panel has really clearly laid out how we could seize those. So yeah, I'm with you. Patricia,
anything you want to add or reinforce? And then are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Oh, I'm always optimistic. And I think we have to be, there's no point in being pessimistic in my mind. I do think there's it's a time of opportunity. And if you think about innovation, by definition, innovation just isn't new products and services, it's new ways of doing things. Mm-hmm. So you went through the long list of systems that are broken. And again, they're all connected. So stepping back and looking at that, what are entirely new ways of thinking these things through, that's what makes me optimistic.
Great, thanks for that. And Gary, you get the final word on these two questions.
Good form to allow the man on the panel to have the last word, but I'll.
Okay, I'll take the last word.
Okay. I do think in a few minutes of optimism that I allow myself a day, or that that I feel per day, I do think that men doing some more of the hands-on care work, even if it's still an unequal amount, and we're gonna keep calling that out, does begin to change and have men see the self-interest in why it needs to be done and why we should do it and why our lives are better when we actually do our share of it. So I am slightly encouraged that maybe men will begin to vote more like women and support caring economies and health and social services, and not think of economics as a winner take all. I also think there might be, a learning cycle that some countries who voted for some conservative masculinist, hyper-masculine, whatever adjective you want to use for them, we'll see how horrible of an idea that was, and that we will see some learning from that, particularly, some of the men who voted for such leaders. Those are the 10 minutes of optimism I feel a day, but I think there's it's reasonably grounded.
Fantastic. I'd like to thank our panelists. Let's give them a virtual round of applause for all of their insights. I'd also like to tell our audience, I hope you've heard some of the suggestions of the panel. Amplify women's voices, amplify the ideas for these building forward stronger approaches. If you can go to the data resources that Valerie and others have put in the chat and on this panel, help to be part of the conversation of getting the data and the evidence. And most importantly, partner with somebody who you think is important to build forward stronger for gender equality. So thank you so much, everybody, and goodbye.
Thank you all.